This is Reid. Before we begin, subscribe, like, and share, because today I'll tell you a story that reminds us sometimes the worst prison isn't built with bars and chains, but with whispered lies that slowly convince you you're worthless. John Carter was 38 when he began to realize something inside him was breaking, not overnight, but slowly, like a rope stretching silently until it lost its strength. On the outside, his life seemed normal, married for 14 years to Olivia, 36, father of 2 boys, Ethan, 12, and Noah, 7. He worked at a local insurance office and came home at the same time every night. He ate Sunday lunch with his children, paid his bills on time, and rarely raised his voice. But John no longer knew if he was a good father or if he was just pretending to be one. And this thought wasn't the result of concrete mistakes. It was something Olivia had subtly planted in him, with small, seemingly harmless phrases that accumulated like stones stuck in his chest. "You never quite understand what boys need," she would say in a calm, almost sweet tone. Or, "They like me better because I know what I'm doing." At first, John saw these comments as simple criticisms of everyday life. Over time, he began to believe that perhaps being a father was a role he never quite fulfilled, even though he was present, even though he tried. Olivia didn't yell. She didn't push him. She didn't physically betray him. She didn't humiliate him in front of others. On the contrary, when visiting, she always calmly told visitors that John was a good man, just a little distracted, sometimes lost, but he tries. This subtle choice of words created a specific portrait of him to the world. Someone fragile, insecure, almost childish. And unlike direct attacks, these phrases gained strength precisely because they were said with tenderness. They were poison wrapped in understanding. John, who had never doubted his ability to lead his life, began to look at himself in the mirror with suspicion. Sometimes Olivia would approach him while he was trying to help Ethan with his homework and say, smiling, "Leave it, honey. You always end up confusing him." And Ethan, a child still trying to understand who should listen, would start looking for his mother. Even Noah, too young to understand the manipulation, seemed to believe his father was a nuisance. John began to withdraw a little more from childcare, not because he didn't love them, but out of fear of making a mistake. And by avoiding participation, he unwittingly began to test Olivia's words. As the months passed, John began to notice that it wasn't just him who was changing. His children were too. Ethan, 12, was old enough to realize that his mother always took the lead in everything. When John tried to suggest something, Olivia would say almost affectionately, "Leave it to me. You always get lost in the details." Ethan listened, absorbed, and without fully understanding, began to think that trusting his father was risky. Noah, still too young to form his own judgments, simply went with the flow, repeating expressions he'd heard from his mother. "Dad's confusing," he'd say casually, repeating exactly the words Olivia had uttered the night before while playing with John. And when John tried to correct something, Olivia would smile and say, "He doesn't mean any harm. He's just exaggerating." So John wasn't seen as evil. He was portrayed as emotionally unstable, like a big child. And this label, repeated sweetly, was even crueler than any public humiliation because it came disguised as love. He began to avoid making decisions at home for fear of confirming the image of someone who always makes mistakes. It wasn't long before Olivia began manipulating even his memories. When John mentioned something he remembered happening, she would calmly say, "It never happened like that. You're getting confused again, love." And if he persisted, she would hug him and say, "You forget things easily. Sometimes you get a little lost. It's okay, I'll take care of it." Small incidents, like who picked Ethan up from school or who forgot to pay the electric bill, began to be questioned. John found himself replaying events in his mind, and even though he was certain of his version, he began to wonder, am I really remembering them correctly? The worst part wasn't doubting the facts, but beginning to doubt his own mind. Instead of confronting her, he kept quiet to avoid arguments that always ended, with Olivia being patient and him being portrayed as confused and overly sensitive. At the end of many nights, John would sleep, staring at the ceiling, wondering at what point he had become such an easily broken man. And, devastatingly, he was beginning to believe that maybe Olivia was right. Maybe he was too weak to carry responsibility. Gradually, Olivia began to shift her comments from small small domestic situations to something bigger, John's identity as a man. When he tried to discuss a work issue, she would smile and say, "You take everything so seriously. No one sees you the way you think." And if John showed frustration at not being promoted, Olivia would sigh with false empathy. "Maybe you're not cut out for leadership. You always end up fumbling when it comes to making decisions." At first, he would get irritated, saying she was minimizing his difficulties, but Olivia always countered with a calm, disappointed look. "I just want you to understand your place. It helps you. Suffer less?" Over time, John stopped trying to defend himself, as each attempt ended with him apologizing for being too harsh. Ethan and Noah began repeating expressions like, "Mommy knows best," and "Daddy always makes things complicated," and John became even more silent, trying not to be a burden on his own family. Olivia didn't need to raise her voice. She could simply question his capabilities with the subtlety of someone who was just telling the truth. John began to see himself as someone who was only there to pay the bills and avoid causing trouble. It was at this point that Olivia's coldness began to take on a new form: emotional detachment. She stopped treating him like a husband. She no longer sought closeness, affection, or prolonged eye contact. When John tried to talk about marriage, she would reply, "It's hard to feel connected to someone so emotionally insecure." John began to realize that even though he was by her side every night, he had been feeling alone for months. One day, trying to regain some intimacy, he touched her hand, and Olivia gently pulled away, as if dealing with someone too fragile to understand their place. "Don't force yourself to be something you're not. Trying to appear confident only makes you appear desperate," she said in an almost clinical tone, as if making a diagnosis. That night, John looked in the mirror and, for the first time, didn't recognize himself. Not because he had aged, but because he could no longer see a man there. He wondered if he had always been this way, or if he had simply become who Olivia said he was. Beginning to accept the idea that he was a worthless man, John began to observe himself through Olivia's eyes. When he came home after a day of work, he noticed the way his children ran to her, not to him. Ethan would tell his mother about his high school accomplishments, and only then, out of politeness, would he look at his father and say something quick, as if he were a secondary observer. In his own home, Noah stopped asking John for bedtime stories and began to sleep only when Olivia tucked him in. John told himself that maybe it was for the best. They don't need someone who confuses everything, he thought. He began to notice his steps within his own house becoming lighter, as if trying to avoid attention. He waited for Olivia to tell him what to do, not because she told him to, but because he no longer trusted his own sense of direction. The lack of outbursts made everything seem peaceful, but in reality, it was the cruelest kind of psychological warfare, the kind that makes someone stop fighting because they believe they've already lost before they've even begun. The turning point came on a seemingly ordinary evening. John was serving dinner to the boys while Olivia finished something on her phone. Noah dropped his juice glass, and John bent down to quickly clean it up, calmly saying it wasn't a problem. Before he could complete the gesture, Olivia approached and, grabbing John's shoulder, said in front of their children, "You always make it sound worse than it is. You'll scare Noah with your anxiety." John froze. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't gotten angry, but there he was, being portrayed as unstable again. Noah looked at him uncertainly. Ethan crossed his arms, as if confirming something he already believed, and John, clutching a rag in his hand, realized that not even his good intentions were being interpreted correctly. After dinner, he locked himself in the bathroom for longer than usual and stared at his reflection, searching for signs of imbalance. And when he found none, he felt afraid, because, in that moment, he realized that even though he didn't see any flaws in himself, he still believed they existed. The doubt about his sanity was more frightening than any obvious offense. It was then that he began to think that perhaps the problem wasn't in the world, but only in himself. Over time, John began to speak less and less. At work, he answered only when necessary. His classmates noticed he was more withdrawn, but he said he was just tired. At home, he became almost invisible. Olivia no longer needed to correct him as often. He had learned to censor himself before acting or speaking. The children no longer asked his opinion on anything, and he no longer offered advice. Gradually, he withdrew from family decisions, convinced that his intervention would would only complicate matters. Ethan began to see him as weak and perpetually fearful. Noah, still young, simply grew accustomed to the idea that his father was someone who didn't lead, didn't protect, but simply existed. Olivia observed everything with a dangerous calm. When John tried to initiate small talk with her, Olivia responded distantly, like someone talking to a roommate, not a husband. Gradually, John began to feel that his presence didn't matter, that he existed only out of habit. Olivia sensed he was emotionally broken and subtly changed the game. If she had previously belittled him with passive-aggressive phrases, she now adopted a maternal and controlling stance. "You're so overwhelmed, John. Maybe you should rest more." Or, "If you feel lost, I can help you organize your thoughts." She positioned herself as an emotional guide, making him depend on her validation to feel like he was on the right path. Olivia no longer simply destroyed his self-confidence. She now presented herself as the only source of stability he still had. Some nights, when he seemed distressed without knowing why, she would say, "You feel this way because you fight against your own nature. Accept who you are." John wasn't sure what that meant, but her tone made him seem inevitably weak, and resisting was futile. He began to believe that perhaps his only role was to obey, not to question. When Olivia left with the children without calling him, he waited silently, telling himself that perhaps it was for the best, because deep down he already believed his presence could disrupt their time. Olivia began to expand her control beyond the walls of her home. At school meetings, when teachers commented on the boys' good behavior, she would smile and say, "It's just that I'm very organized. John is the heart of the house, but he's not very good with routine." She said it in a gentle, almost conspiratorial tone, and people laughed without realizing what she meant. It was venom disguised as praise, and John sensed it but couldn't react. If he tried to defend himself, he would appear petty. If he remained silent, he confirmed the image of a confused and dependent man. At family dinners, Olivia did the same. She would comment that he gets stressed easily, or that sometimes he forgets what he said, and everyone would laugh as if it were a domestic joke. The problem was, the more she repeated it, the more natural it became. People began to treat him with a subtle condescension, the kind of look one gives someone emotionally unstable. John noticed the sidelong glances, the smiles that faded too quickly, the conversations that changed subject when he approached. John's isolation was no longer just internal, it became social. His co-workers stopped inviting him to lunch, and even his neighbors seemed more distant. He noticed that when Olivia spoke to them, her tone was always one of understanding. "John's going through a rough patch, but I support him through everything." This destroyed him inside, because he no longer knew if Olivia was doing it out of malice, or if she truly believed he needed help. And that was her greatest power, making even her intentions seem good. John tried to remember who he was before all this. The man who made his colleagues laugh, the father who taught Ethan to ride a bike, the husband who believed in love. But these memories came back distorted, as if they belonged to someone else. Olivia had achieved what she wanted, to transform John into a man who doubted not only the present, but even his own past. John began to feel like someone walking through a dark room, carrying a broken mirror, seeing distorted fragments of himself, unsure which of them were still real. Sometimes, while driving to work, he wondered if Olivia was right, if perhaps he really was someone unstable, incapable, insecure by nature. He couldn't remember when he'd started feeling this way. It seemed he'd always been weak, though a tiny voice inside him still whispered that wasn't true. But that whisper grew quieter. Every day, he began to have difficulty making simple decisions, like choosing what to wear or what to buy at the grocery store, because he was always afraid of messing up again. At night, when everyone was asleep, he would sit in the living room, motionless, trying to understand where the man who used to dream of something greater was. But the more he tried to find himself, the more lost he felt. Olivia, as always, noticed everything and said, almost affectionately, "You think too much, John. Trust me more. I know what's best for you. And each time he accepted this kind of phrase, a new part of himself would silently fade away. The worst moment came when Ethan avoided eye contact when responding to something his father said, as if he didn't take anything he said seriously. Or when Noah innocently asked, "Daddy, why are you sad?" John never answered, just ran his hand through his son's hair and said he was tired. But what he felt wasn't tiredness. It was the feeling that Olivia had turned his life into a room with no exits, and he was just a visitor in his own home. He began to experience small bouts of anxiety without fully understanding why. Rapid breathing, unexplained fear, a constant feeling of inadequacy. One day, when he tried to explain to Olivia that he felt something wrong inside him, she responded with a tone of cruel sweetness. "Maybe you need help. I knew that eventually you'd realize you can't handle everything alone." John didn't argue. He simply nodded. In that moment, he realized he was beginning to believe he needed saving, and that Olivia was the only person capable of deciding whether he deserved it. When John finally admitted to himself that something was wrong with his mind, he couldn't tell if this recognition was genuine or simply another idea Olivia had planted in him. Anxiety began to creep in at random moments, when trying to talk to Ethan, when walking into a meeting at work, when hearing Olivia sigh in disapproval even though she hadn't said anything. He began to avoid mirrors because he no longer saw a man. He saw someone defeated who had disappointed everyone. Olivia sensed he was emotionally at his limit and began treating him with a kind of care that seemed like affection but was actually disguised control. "You need to trust me more," she would say every time he hesitated. "Don't try to solve anything on your own. You'll mess things up." John began asking permission for simple decisions. What time to sleep, how to talk to his kids, even whether he should go to work, even when he wasn't feeling well. Ethan began looking at him with a mixture of pity and irritation. Noah, still innocent, began asking his mother if his father was sick in the head, and Olivia would just sigh and say, "He just needs someone to guide him." John heard these words from behind a door, and for a few seconds he believed they might be true. But it was on a silent night that the feeling of failure became overwhelming. Sitting on the edge of the bed, while Olivia slept soundly beside him as if carrying a clear conscience, John looked up at the ceiling and felt an emptiness so great it seemed he couldn't fit inside his chest. He thought about his children and wondered if they would be happier without the constant presence of someone Olivia said was fragile and confused. For the first time, a terrible idea crossed his mind. Perhaps disappearing was the easiest way to end everyone's suffering. He wasn't thinking about dying. Exactly, not yet. But he imagined what it would be like to just leave, not come back. Let Olivia take care of everything, as she said she did best. For a few minutes, the idea seemed almost logical. He got up, went to the bathroom, and looked at himself in the mirror. He didn't see a man or a father. He saw someone who no longer knew how to exist. He approached the glass as if to break through it, and as he looked into his own eyes, he murmured, Am I here, or do I just seem to be?" It was that night that he realized that if he stayed there, Olivia wouldn't just control his life. She would eventually completely erase any version of him that still tried to survive. The morning after that suffocating night, John woke with a strange feeling, a mixture of profound exhaustion and painful clarity. Going downstairs, he found Olivia in the kitchen, packing Noah's lunchbox with the same methodical calm as always. Ethan was silently sipping coffee. John tried to smile at his children, but Ethan just looked away, while Noah nodded quickly and turned his attention to his mother. Olivia sensed his discomfort, and without even meeting his eyes, said in a sweet but sharp tone, "Don't force yourself, John. They can sense when you're unstable." It was a silent stab, but this time, something inside John didn't break. It just went numb. He finished his coffee in silence and left for work, but when he got to his car, he stood there for a few minutes with his hands trembling on the steering wheel. It was then that he realized He no longer had the strength to fight for a life in which he was treated like an intruder. And for the first time, the idea of disappearing no longer felt like cowardice. It felt like survival. But still, there was something holding him back. Ethan and Noah. He was afraid to leave, afraid that one day they would remember him as someone who simply left because he was too weak. And yet, the pain of staying seemed to destroy him faster than the pain of leaving. The breakdown happened a few days later, on a seemingly ordinary Sunday. Ethan had been scolded for getting a lower grade in school, and when John tried to console him by saying that everyone makes mistakes, Olivia interrupted and said in front of her son, "Don't use yourself as an example, John. He doesn't need failed role models." Ethan didn't defend his father. He just stood silently, absorbing the message. John felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, but instead of reacting angrily, he simply retreated and went upstairs to his room, like someone who knows they no longer have a place in their own home. He sat on the floor and hugged his knees, feeling a throbbing pain in his chest, but unable to cry, because even the tears seemed to have been taken from him. It was at that moment that he realized that if he didn't leave, he would soon cease to exist completely. Perhaps he would still be breathing, but as an obedient, empty ghost, a shadow shaped by Olivia. And that was when something inside him whispered more forcefully than before. Either you leave, or she will erase you forever. That night, John stayed up late, sitting at the kitchen table, observing the quiet house. Ethan had locked himself in his room after studying, Noah slept with a toy in his arms, and Olivia read calmly on the couch as if nothing were out of place. John realized his absence wouldn't make much noise. Maybe it wouldn't even be felt immediately. It pained him to admit it, but the realization also gave him a strange kind of freedom. He got up slowly and went to his children's room. He watched each of them silently, as if trying to memorize their faces. He whispered something they couldn't hear. "I need to come back as someone you can trust, not someone you pity." After that, he went to his room and grabbed an old backpack. He didn't take much, some clothes, documents, and a notebook where, long ago, he'd jotted down ideas and thoughts that Olivia called sentimental nonsense. He also grabbed an old photo from when he could still smile without fear of appearing weak. As he passed by the living room, Olivia saw him with the backpack and asked, without looking up from her book, "Are you going out?" John simply replied, "I'm going to breathe." Olivia, with calm arrogance, simply murmured, "Just don't get more lost than you already are." John swallowed hard and got out. In the car, his hands were shaking so badly that it took him a few minutes to start the engine. When he finally drove, he had no clear destination, only the certainty that he needed to get away. He drove for hours until he stopped in a small town nearby, where he managed to rent a simple room in a cheap inn. That first night away from Olivia and his children, he felt a devastating pain, as if he were committing an irreversible abandonment. But at the same time, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: relief. Not because he was away from his children, that hurt him deeply, but because for the first time he was away from the voice that told him every day that he was worthless. He cried, not in despair, but like someone finally understanding the extent of the damage he had suffered. And, in the midst of that silent weeping, he made a promise: "I'll come back, but not as this broken man. I'll come back whole." And it was with this promise that his rebuilding began. Not with strength, but with the brutal vulnerability of someone who needs to relearn how to believe in themselves before asking others to believe in them again. John's rebuilding didn't begin with strength. It began with breakdowns. In the first days away from Olivia, he would wake up startled, expecting to hear her voice correcting something he hadn't even done. He felt guilty when eating, as if he still needed approval. When he looked at the photo of his children, his heart ached with the feeling that he had abandoned them. He tried to convince himself that leaving had been necessary, but he still struggled with the idea that he had only run away because he was weak, as Olivia said. It wasn't until one night, sitting on the floor of his rented room, that he said out loud, "I am not weak. I have been weakened." That something in him had a small click. It wasn't strength yet, but it was awareness. With that thought, he decided to seek help. He found a support group for emotionally abused people, where he heard stories of others who, like him, had spent years believing their own minds were the enemy. There were meetings where he couldn't say anything. He just cried quietly while others spoke. But gradually, he realized there were patterns in what Olivia did, minimizing, distorting memories, projecting insecurities, using her children as validation. It was there that he first heard the word gaslighting and understood that what he experienced had a name. And if it had a name, then it wasn't his invention. John began individual therapy. At first, he could barely answer simple questions like, "What do you like?" because he no longer knew what was his and what was imposed. He trembled when talking about his children, afraid to accept that he had left them with their manipulator. But the therapist didn't judge him. Instead, she said, "You left not because you abandoned them, but because realized that if he stayed, Olivia would destroy the only version of himself that could still fight for them." That sentence changed something in him. John began to rebuild himself step by step. He began exercising, reading again, books Olivia called emotional nonsense. He wrote down his thoughts, not because they had answers, but to keep from sinking into silence. There were relapses, nights of fear, days when he questioned whether he should have stayed, days when he felt he would never be worthy of his children. But there were also small signs of progress. He stopped asking mental permission to exist. He began to look in the mirror without flinching. And on better days, he began to imagine not just surviving, but returning, not to prove anything to Olivia, but to show his children that a man can fall and still rise without becoming the monster they tried to make him out to be. Months passed. John was no longer the man who trembled when he looked in the mirror, but he still bore visible scars in his posture and gaze. He began working at a local auto repair shop, something different from his old job, but one that allowed him to feel like he was building something with his own hands. The sensation of tightening screws, repairing engines, and seeing concrete results helped heal some of the void Olivia had left, because there, the mistakes he made didn't become proof of incapacity, but rather learning opportunities. He rediscovered a version of himself capable of doing something without fear of judgment. Gradually, he began to gain the trust of his clients and receive sincere, uncompromising praise. In the support group, he began to speak with more confidence, even offering emotional support to new members who arrived broken, just as he had once been. When he mentioned his children, he now cried not only with pain, but also with hope. He saved each small victory, so he could one day tell Ethan and Noah that their father had fought, and this time won without hurting anyone. He knew he couldn't just return by knocking on the door. Olivia still controlled the narrative her children heard. If he showed up unprepared, she would destroy him again, perhaps not with yelling, but with calculated disdain. So John began legally documenting his recovery. He participated in psychological evaluations that attested to his stability. He recovered emotionally and completed mental health programs. He stored documents, testimonies, and evidence of his progress, not with the intention of starting a legal battle, but rather to protect his sanity in case Olivia tried to make him doubt himself again. Despite this, there were nights he lay awake, wondering if his children remembered the loving father he once was, or if they simply harbored the distorted image Olivia had created. In these moments, he fought the urge to give up, repeating to himself, "I'd rather they see me as someone who walked away, only to come back better, than as someone who stayed until I was destroyed." And it was with this thought that John decided he was almost ready to try to return, not to regain what he'd lost, but to show that, despite the pain, he'd chosen to be reborn. John knew he couldn't simply appear before his children expecting an emotional reunion. Ethan was now 13, and Noah was 8, enough time for Olivia to shape his perceptions calmly and steadily. So he decided to begin quietly and respectfully. He contacted a lawyer specializing in family reunification cases, explaining that he didn't want to tear his children away from their mother or start a war, but simply to prove he was emotionally fit to exist in their lives. The lawyer listened attentively and said, "If you've truly changed, your greatest weapon won't be a process, but your stability over time." She advised John to begin with a formal, balanced request for supervised visitation as a first step toward demonstrating responsibility. At the same time, she suggested something delicate, writing a letter to Ethan, the oldest, since he was old enough to understand complex feelings. John hesitated, fearing Ethan wouldn't read it, but knew he had to risk it. So he wrote an honest letter, not asking for forgiveness outright, but saying, "I didn't leave because I gave up on you. I left because I was so broken that I couldn't have fought for you if I stayed. But now I'm fighting to be someone you can look at without fear of getting hurt." The letter was sent with legal consent and delivered by appropriate means, ensuring it reached Ethan without direct interference from Olivia. Days later, Ethan found the envelope among his school books. He read it silently, saying nothing to his mother at first. He didn't cry, he didn't smile, he just sat in silence for long minutes, the letter resting on his lap. When Olivia saw him pensive, she casually asked, "Is something wrong at school?" Ethan hesitated before answering, "It's Dad's." Olivia froze for a second, but quickly regained her calm expression. She approached slowly and asked to see the letter, but Ethan tucked the paper into his pocket and said, "I want to think it over alone." Olivia realized that, for the first time, she wasn't in complete control of the narrative. That night, Ethan slept clutching the letter, unsure if he still hated his father or if he was beginning to remember a time when he didn't need to hate him. And though Noah was still too young to understand, that letter planted a new seed, not of immediate forgiveness, but of doubt. And sometimes doubt is the first step to breaking a carefully constructed lie. Olivia noticed the change in Ethan's demeanor. He was quieter, but not in a detached way. He seemed thoughtful, like someone comparing old memories with new information. Seeing this, Olivia decided to cautiously regain control. One afternoon, as they were setting the table for dinner, she casually said, "Your father was always overly emotional. When things got tough, he couldn't handle it." Ethan didn't respond. Olivia continued, this time with a slightly sad tone. "I tried to help, but he chose to run away and left us alone. Do you remember how you cried that night?" Ethan swallowed hard. He remembered the pain, but now he also remembered his father's look, tired, broken. Olivia realized she would need something stronger. That night, she entered Ethan's room and said, "He always said he loved you, but loving doesn't mean abandoning." Ethan snapped his fingers lightly, anxiously, and then he murmured, "But what if he couldn't stay? What if staying destroyed him?" The sentence hung in the air. It was the first time he had verbalized a possibility different from the single version Olivia had fed him. And in that moment she understood. The narrative was no longer completely in her hands. In an attempt to prevent Ethan from getting emotionally close to his father, Olivia began subtly reinforcing scenes from the past in which John seemed unstable, but avoided exaggerating so as not to appear desperate. But something had changed in Ethan. He began to think not only about what his father had been, but about who he could become. Deep down, he still carried resentment, but now it was accompanied by a question. What if he really is trying to change? One day, Ethan looked at an old photo of John holding him on his shoulders during a walk. He remembered a time his father taught him how to fix a bike chain, and how safe he felt in that moment. The memory didn't match the portrait of a cowardly man, and this created conflict. Olivia realized Ethan didn't respond when she said, "He's always been afraid of growing up." Her son's silence wasn't agreement, it was reflection. And when a teenager begins to think for himself, controlling his mind becomes a much more difficult battle than controlling his emotions. 8-year-old Noah wasn't clear about the emotional dynamics between his father and mother. For him, John's absence was something that happened because he disappeared, but the meaning wasn't as charged as it was for Ethan. He didn't remember every situation like Ethan did, but he still retained some sensory memories. His father tossing him in the air in the backyard, John's voice reading stories at night, the smell of coffee his father made on Sunday mornings. He had flashes of affection more than memories of conflict. So when he saw Ethan holding the letter for days on end, Noah began asking questions. "Are you going to let him come?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He didn't even know what "let him come" meant. Noah then asked, "Do you remember when he taught me to swim?" I was happy. Ethan remained silent, but these Memories stirred him more than any of Olivia's speeches. Noah didn't harbor the same internalized hatred. For him, his father was neither a villain nor a hero, just someone who was there and then wasn't. And perhaps this gave John a chance to reconnect, at least with his youngest son, through the good memories that still lingered. It was at this delicate emotional moment that John's lawyer informed him that Olivia had agreed to a preliminary legal mediation to discuss possible supervised meetings, not willingly, but because she knew that completely refusing could be construed as parental alienation. Olivia looked at Ethan and Noah as she broke the news and said firmly, "He asked to see you, but that doesn't mean he's ready, or that he deserves it." Ethan remained silent. Noah asked simply, "But will he be mad if I hug him?" Olivia hesitated, but replied coolly, "You do what you want, but don't expect him to be." Ethan felt this sentence sting, because he realized Olivia was still trying to shape how they should interpret John's return, not as an opportunity, but as a threat. However, something had already shifted within him, and now, instead of absorbing the statement as truth, he began to question it. This first emotional breach would be the path through which John would carefully try to rebuild a bond, not with promises, but with presence. The first reunion took place at a family mediation center in a neutral room with pale walls and cold furniture. John arrived too early, sitting on the edge of his chair like someone about to be judged. His hands trembled slightly, and he struggled to keep his breathing steady. The therapist in charge explained that the boys had the right to look, speak, or remain silent. When the door opened and Ethan entered with Noah at his side and Olivia waiting outside, time seemed to stand still. John didn't get up immediately. He was afraid any movement would be interpreted as invasive. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed, his expression closed, not out of hatred but out of caution. Noah, not fully understanding the weight of the moment, looked at his father as one might look at someone they've seen in dreams and memories. A familiar face the heart recognizes before the mind accepts it. John swallowed hard and simply said quietly, "Hi." There was no immediate response. The therapist focused on the boys and said, "You can talk to him if you want." Noah, almost in a whisper, replied, "Hi, Daddy." That small, hesitant word hit John with the force of all the memories he'd vowed to recapture. He didn't cry, because he knew this first meeting wasn't the place to break down. He just smiled, his eyes brimming with tears, and said, "Thank you for coming." Silence dominated the first few minutes. Ethan watched his father's every expression, as if trying to figure out if this man was the same man who'd once disappeared, or if he'd truly changed. He didn't trust him, but he didn't pull away either. Noah, more impulsive, suddenly asked, "Are you leaving again?" John took a deep breath and replied gently, "I'll stay, but only if you want me around, and I won't rush anything." Ethan seemed surprised. He'd expected big, desperate promises, not this kind of calm sincerity. When Noah asked if he still knew how to fix bikes, Ethan gave his brother a quick look as if to say, "It's not easy." But John smiled slightly and replied, "I've learned to do a lot of things better than before." The meeting was short, supervised, and uncomfortably controlled. But when it ended, something had changed. Ethan left still confused, but less certain of his hatred. Noah left with a new doubt. If he's lying, why did I feel like staying a little longer? And John left not with the certainty that he would win his children back, but with the conviction that this time he was ready to stay, even if his steps were slow and filled with fear. The supervised visits continued for a few weeks. John never insisted on hugs, never tried to justify himself too much, never tried to play the victim. He spoke little, listened a lot. He gave his children space to react as they wished, even when their reaction was only silence. During one of the visits, Ethan asked directly, "Why didn't you try to stay? Why didn't you fight back then?" John took a deep breath before answering, "Because I didn't know how to fight without completely losing who I was. I needed to leave to understand how to come back for..." "You..." "Not out of fear of her." Ethan didn't respond immediately, but the way he frowned indicated the answer had gotten to him. He didn't fully trust her, but he began to realize that perhaps his father hadn't acted out of weakness, but emotional exhaustion. Noah, for his part, began to laugh at little things when John told silly stories, childhood memories Olivia had never been able to completely erase. The therapist noticed that the boys were no longer as tense around their father, and that the visiting environment was shifting from a minefield to a space for careful breathing. Olivia began to show discomfort. She realized that John never tried to attack or expose her, and this made it even harder to continue painting him as unstable. When Ethan returned from one of the visits and said in a neutral voice, "He's different," Olivia responded coldly, "They always pretend to be better at first." But Ethan replied with unusual firmness, "He's not pretending. He's quiet, but he's not broken." This statement made Olivia's gaze harden for the first time. Realizing that the image of a fragile, confused man was beginning to crumble in her eldest son's eyes shook her control. She tried to introduce new, subtle comments, but they no longer resonated with the same force as before. Ethan now compared what she said with what he saw. Noah remained more emotional, but showed no fear of his father, and this was another danger sign for Olivia. John, without raising his voice, without demanding anything, without pressing any emotion, was slowly returning as a presence. And for those who build power over absence, presence is the greatest threat. Their first private conversation took place on a cloudy late afternoon, when Ethan asked, unexpectedly, to see his father without Noah present. The therapist allowed it, as the process had shown signs of stability. John arrived in the room with a calm expression, but inside, the fear of saying the wrong thing consumed every step. Ethan sat with his arms crossed, as he always did when trying to appear stronger than he felt. John waited a few seconds before sitting down. The silence was long, uncomfortable, but not hostile. Then Ethan asked bluntly, "Did you think about us when you left?" John didn't lie. "Every day, but I couldn't think about you without feeling like I was the worst part of your lives." Ethan looked away. John continued, "I was afraid to go back, because I thought you'd be better off without me." Ethan finally looked at his father and said, "I was angry. I thought you were a coward, and I still do sometimes." John nodded and replied, "You have every right to think that." Ethan expected excuses, but there were none, only acceptance. And that confused him, because Olivia had taught him that his father always ran away, even from the truth. But there he was, not running away from his own son's judgment. Ethan took a deep breath, clasping his hands as if trying to maintain his composure against The mix of emotions. Then he said in a thin voice, "I don't know if I want you back. I don't know if I can trust you." John replied calmly, "You don't have to decide that today. You just need to watch me and see if I can stay. Because I'm going to stay here, even if you push me away a few times." Ethan remained silent. A part of him wanted to get up and leave, but another, quieter part wanted to see if this man would maintain this posture any longer. When the session ended, Ethan left without hugging his father. But this time, he didn't avoid John's gaze as they said goodbye. He stared at him for a few seconds, searching for signs of a lie, and found none. John didn't smile, didn't cry. He simply said sincerely, "Thank you for talking to me." Ethan left knowing he hadn't forgiven his father, but also realizing he could no longer hate him with the same certainty. Olivia began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Fear, not of John's return per se, but of what he represented now, not a weak man trying to explain himself, but someone who had learned to remain silent and stable. The old strategy of labeling him as confused no longer worked. The small insinuations about his emotional instability no longer had the same effect on Ethan, who now observed and compared narratives with his own perception. Even Noah, just 8 years old, no longer received his mother's remarks with automatic acceptance, but instead asked, "But Daddy's calm. Why do you seem angry?" Olivia tried to react the way she always did, with passive-aggressive logic. "He's only calm because he wants to impress you. People tend to fake it at first." But Ethan's response was an unexpected blow. "Even if that's the case, did you seem happier when he was weak?" This question cut deeper than any direct attack. For the first time, Olivia realized that her children were beginning to construct their own version of reality, and she couldn't completely shape it for much longer. In a last-ditch attempt to destabilize John, Olivia agreed to a joint meeting without clinical supervision. She arrived confident, expecting to find the insecure man she had once modeled. But when John entered, greeting her calmly and confidently, without diminishing himself, she realized that his gaze no longer held the desperate gleam of someone seeking approval. It held the quiet firmness of someone who had survived hell and come back whole. Olivia tried her usual weapon, saying in a low, emotionally charged voice, "You'll break again. You always do." But this time John didn't defend himself. He didn't try to convince her otherwise. He simply replied with restrained serenity, "Maybe I will, but when I do, I'll know how to rebuild myself without destroying the ones I love. That's something I learned away from your control." Olivia opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't formulate a convincing narrative, because in that moment she realized her words no longer held power. Over him, he didn't need to shout nor fight back, he just stood his ground. And ironically, this quiet stability was the final blow to the image of weakness she had built for years. The gradual reunion with her children became a routine of small, silent victories. John remained present, never forcing emotions, never trying to rush things. Over time, Noah began greeting him with a half-smile before sitting next to him during visits. Ethan, still harboring deep doubts, continued to observe his father's every gesture, but now without the same accusatory look. Instead, there was a kind of honest analysis. One ordinary day, while Noah was drawing, Ethan said, without looking directly at John, "You're still here." John calmly replied, "Yes, and I will be." Ethan was silent for a few seconds, and this time he didn't cross his arms or look away. First step. He still didn't call John Dad confidently, and Noah still asked if he was going to disappear again sometimes. But now John responded with an emotional firmness that didn't need to be loud. I left because I was broken. I'm coming back because now I can be whole. And that, little by little, began to make sense to them. Olivia watched the slow rebuilding of bonds with suppressed irritation. But now she couldn't distort what her children saw with their own eyes, because John didn't return desperately begging for forgiveness, nor wanting to erase the past. He returned accepting the consequences and offering constancy, and constancy is often more powerful than any cry for redemption. Over time, the boys began to accept regular, unsupervised visits, and Ethan began talking to John about small things, like school, routine, thoughts about the future. There was no magic phrase like, "I forgive you," but there was a moment on an ordinary day when Noah, distracted, called him Dad, without thinking. John didn't cry then. But that night, alone, he was grateful that he'd still managed to find a place in their lives. He didn't want to destroy Olivia or prove anything. He just wanted to go on living without carrying the weight of who they'd told him he was. He'd survived the worst version of himself. And now he was building, over time, an emotional home that didn't depend on anyone's approval. This time, he chose to stay, not out of perfection, but out of courage. This was Marcus Reid, and sometimes the greatest form of vengeance isn't shouting, "I survived," but standing quietly in front of the person who tried to break you, and existing so powerfully that they can no longer deny you healed.